Hi, folks. I just wanted to kind of continue where we left off yesterday. I'm going to give some of the lecture myself, and then I have some of another video that I'm going to show you to finish off the lecture. So yesterday we were talking about the word economic depression, right? And we see that it's a long-lasting decrease in sales, production, and jobs. So the depression doesn't mean that people are sad. It's that the whole economy is decreased or depressed. Okay, and this period overall obviously has a huge impact on Americans, and we're going to look at all of these things in depth. But when we look at some of those things specifically, we look at the very beginning of the Great Depression in 1929, and 23,000 businesses failed. That's a huge amount. Remember, this is almost 100 years ago, so we're talking about a much smaller population overall, many fewer businesses, but we still see some huge numbers. And by, again, 1932, 32,000 more businesses fail. And, you know, I think this is important to see because the Great Depression just carries on well into the 1940s, and things just keep getting worse as far as the economy is concerned. When we look at how much people were earning, there's also a huge decrease. Okay, so the average family was making about $2,300 a year in 1929. By 1935, that decreases all the way down to $1,600 a year. That's, again, a huge change. In our modern economy, if we saw a decrease like that, it would be devastating. So this has a huge impact on people's lives. Unemployment, again, another concept you learn about in depth in economics, but unemployment increased from 5%, which is relatively low in 1929, to 25% in 1932. So the only thing even comparable to this is the level of unemployment this past spring related to coronavirus closures. But even that was maybe not quite as high as 25%. That's a tremendous amount of people out of work. When we think about the causes of the Great Depression, we're going to think about the basic causes of the Great Depression. And what that gives us is 5 nice, very clear, easy to remember causes of the Great Depression, the basic causes of the Great Depression. So the first that we're going to talk about then is business debt. So businesses weren't able to pay back loans because there had been for some time after World War I a bit of a decline in a lot of industries. Okay, so the textile industry, clothing manufacturing had been decreasing, logging had been decreasing, mining, railroad, car sales had even decreased. And construction. Now, construction is still something we use today to understand how well our economy is doing. When people stop building houses, it means people don't have enough money to buy houses. So this is a big indicator. And why this is such a huge problem is because when businesses aren't able to pay back loans, they go out of business, and then they don't hire people, which leads to much higher unemployment. But businesses throughout this period had built up debt. They weren't able to pay for things with cash. They had to borrow money from banks, and they were starting to default on these loans and go out of business. So again, the second basic cause of the Great Depression is agricultural overproduction. During World War I, farms in the United States made a tremendous amount of money. They increased production. They had a lot of new production methods. But the big thing here was that most of Europe had been involved in World War I for several years before the United States had gotten on board. And so when a country's at war, it's very hard to focus on farming. During World War I, many countries were hardly able to produce any food at all. And so the United States produced that food and sold it to them overseas. The problem is that after the war, the farms in the United States continued to produce the same amount of product. Okay, what this did was it made too much product available, and that decreased the value. And so what farmers were having to do was basically not sell their crops or sell them for such a low price that they were losing money. This is a big issue, and it leads to issues all throughout the economy beyond just agriculture. Now, the stock market crash was not the only cause of the Great Depression, but it's the one that we hear about the most, and it happens in 1929 on what's known as Black Tuesday. Throughout most of the 1920s, right, they're referred to as the Roaring Twenties, the economy was pretty strong. People were investing a lot of money in the stock market, but things had started to slow by the end of the 1920s. Despite that, people were still buying a lot of stock. Now, what happens on October 24th, 1929 is that people realize the economy is tanking. They panic and they rush to sell off their stock, and this results in over $30 billion lost almost immediately. This really is one of the final nails in the coffin as far as our economy and descent into the Great Depression goes. Income equality was another major component of the Great Depression. Throughout the 1920s, a lot of businesses were very successful, but worker pay didn't keep up with that level of success. So what this led to was the fact that people didn't have enough money to buy stuff that the businesses were making. Okay, businesses were still wanting to manufacture new products, things like cars, but employees were still being paid a low wage. When you're being paid a low wage, you can't go buy new things like cars. You can't buy new things like clothes. And this led to some major issues. Okay? If we want to think about the income at this time, about $2,500 a year was considered the minimum needed for a family to have a decent standard of living. When we look at this chart here, we see that 65% of the population made under $2,000 a year. Okay? There's an additional 29% that might fall in that category of earning a decent living. And there's very few people, just 1% of the population, that are earning over $10,000 a year. So this is inequality. There's many people, 65%, probably closer to 70 or 80% really when you factor this in, that are living below the poverty line. That's a tremendous amount of people. Then we look at consumer debt. Loans were a new idea, at least from banks, and more people were starting to buy homes with loans. And they couldn't pay these home loans back. Now that causes a lot of problems for the banks because they're counting on the money. And really what it comes down to is that people couldn't pay back these loans because of all these other reasons we've looked at. Income equality, unemployment, overspending, people spending more than they actually earn, and then depressed agriculture and industry kind of added to all of these things. So again, the 5 basic causes of the Great Depression: business debt, agricultural overproduction, stock market crash, income inequality, and consumer debts. So now we're going to turn to a video, and you can continue on answering questions.
Our income class, and things really aren't looking good. So how did the government respond to that? So stick around. Obviously, that's what we're going to be talking about today in class. So today we're going to be talking about responding to the crisis. What does the government do when things get bad? And we're going to try to answer the question, how did the government, including President Hoover, respond to the growing economic crisis at the end of the 1920s? So make sure you grab pencil, paper, open up some notes, get ready to take some notes, pay attention to the video, and hopefully by the end, you'll be able to have a good answer to this question. So when everything went south with our economy back in 1929, President Hoover wound up taking a good majority of the blame for the whole thing. Remember that Hoover is a very much laissez-faire, hands-off kind of a president. He really didn't want to get the government involved. It really wasn't his fault, though. Even though he took a lot of the blame, it really wasn't his fault. Although many Americans really did blame him though for being out of touch. They thought he was out of touch with what Americans were asking for and with what Americans needed. President Hoover did respond with three things when the economy went south. Response number one was a concept that Hoover called rugged individualism. Basically, Herbert Hoover put it back on the American people. He told the American people that they're the ones that should be responsible for bettering themselves through their own efforts. In his view, it wasn't really the government's place to step in and try to help the people out, to help out him out. Because of this concept of rugged individualism, Hoover really refused to provide any kind of direct relief from the government. So basically, Hoover said he didn't want people to be dependent on the government for help every time something went wrong. The second big response that Hoover had to the crisis was a concept called volunteerism. Hoover said that the American people should rely on themselves to do the right thing. So he went around and asked businesses that were still operating to keep wages high and keep prices low and try to keep unemployment from getting any worse. Well, here's the problem with that. If businesses want to survive, there's no way they can keep wages high. There's no way they can keep prices where they're at. There's no way they can prevent any more unemployment. It's just the natural cycle of the economy. Hoover also asked a lot of wealthy people to give to charities. He said, it's not the government's place, but hey, Richie over there, rich guy, Richie, why don't you give a couple $1 million to help these people out? Now think about all the things we've talked about with the wealthy class around this particular time frame. And remember the Gilded Age. Remember everything we talked about during the Progressive Era. How do you think that's going to go over just by asking rich people to help? Probably not too well, right? I doubt it's going to do much. And newsflash, it didn't help. The third big response that Hoover had to this crisis took a little time to develop. Eventually, Hoover realized that the government's gonna have to do something. So he and some of his advisors cook up this idea for a public's work project. If we can get the government to build something, we can put some people to work. That's like the whole logic behind it. And this is where the Hoover Dam comes into place. The Hoover Dam was meant to be a big, giant public works project, and it was meant to provide almost 5,000 people jobs. And it did. Well, here's the problem. When they started to put out a call for workers, 40,000 people showed up. They only needed 5,000. When you have that much unemployment, 40,000 people looking for 5,000 job slots, that's barely going to scratch the surface, right? Now, there was some upside to the Hoover Dam. It did put 5,000 people to work, and I'm sure those people, they were very grateful for that opportunity. When it was completed, it did also provide a lot of water and electricity for the West, which is something that area of the country genuinely needed. There's a big argument to be made that when you had cheap electricity and lots of available water in the area, that would also help to create more jobs. But in the grand scheme of things, this one public works project wasn't even enough to start. It couldn't even start to help solve the problem, right? As I'd mentioned before, Hoover did take a lot of blame for what was happening with the economy. Again, not really his fault, but he's the one that people started to blame. Other government officials tried to help out as well, not just Hoover. One of the most prominent government responses to the crisis was a thing called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act. This comes around in 1930. Basically, this act raised taxes on foreign goods. It significantly raised taxes on foreign-made goods. And this put the tariffs on those goods at the highest they'd ever been on imported goods. And the idea behind this was that if we make imported goods from other countries, so much more expensive, then the American people will buy nothing but domestically American-produced stuff, American-produced products. And that'll help get the American economy going because that will mean people will be working at American factories, things that are made at those factories will get bought, and so on and so forth. But here's the problem. When you jack up tariffs that high on foreign goods, how do you think other countries are going to respond to that? Are they just going to say, okay, no problem, we'll just deal with it? No. Well, this act basically destroyed any kind of international trade that the United States had going on with the rest of the world. Most places like Europe responded with passing tariffs of their own, which made US produced goods outrageously expensive. So this actually made the situation a lot worse. In fact, it made the global economic situation worse. A lot of people don't realize that during the Great Depression, it wasn't just the United States that was suffering. The depression was a global thing. The entire planet was suffering from an economic depression. And this Tariff Act, the Hoover-Smalley Tariff Act, basically just knocked everything down an extra notch and made it even worse. And two other bits of legislation that get passed right around the same time to try to help things out were the Federal Home Loan Bank Act and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation Act. Both of these were government responses to what was happening with the economy. Both had great intentions, but as you'll see here in just a second, both had some serious flaws. So let's take a look at the Federal Home Loan Bank Act first. The idea of this law was to lower mortgage rates across the board. This would allow farmers to refinance their loans. So mortgage loans are loans that they owned on land, on houses, right? So this law would let them refinance those loans and their houses to lower interest rates and try to avoid foreclosure and being kicked off their land, right? But here's the problem. We've talked about the Dust Bowl already. Were farmers able to produce on the land that they had during this time? No, remember there's a natural disaster going on that really prevented a lot of farmers from being able to do that. Yeah, it was nice that they lowered mortgage rates in this law, but when you don't have any money to pay, period, because you're not able to grow crops, a lower mortgage rate really isn't going to help you out much, right? The other major piece of legislation that got passed was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation Act. Basically, this was the government authorizing $2 million to be distributed for this emergency financing of big business. The idea was if we kept the big businesses like the banks, the railroads, those kinds of things open, this would help drive the economy and we could get back on track. So essentially what this law did is the government gave $2 million to the richest people in the United States. Were the richest people in the United States suffering? No, it was the middle and lower income classes that were having some serious problems. So this really didn't do much of anything to alleviate the majority of Americans suffering during the Great Depression. All this did was make the rich people just a little bit richer. And I really only have two takeaways from this part of the video for you. Number one is remember Hoover's response. You've got rugged individualism, volunteerism, and public works projects. The second takeaway is the government's response. Remember the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So next we're going to talk about life